The training is all in your mind. That is one of the most profound and insightful things my instructor Rickson ever told me about Jiu-Jitsu and basically how to develop yourself in Jiu-Jitsu. I was at his house as I think I was about a brown belt at the time. And I just remember that I was getting to the point where I was kind of one of the more senior students at the gym. And in those days, there wasn't a lot of black belts around. It's not, jiu-jitsu wasn't as big as it is now. So this is almost 20 years ago. It wasn't as big as it is now. There weren't as many people training, and there were far fewer black belts. The guys who had gotten their black belts before me were older guys that basically weren't training that much anymore. They had lives, or they lived far away, and they would come in to train very rarely. And so I felt like I didn't have a lot of training partners at the time that were much higher level than me, that were way better than me. Most of the guys at my gym at the time, I was starting to dominate pretty consistently. And so I asked Rickson, because that is something that was always really curious to me. I asked him, I said, Rickson, how do you get better? What do you do to get better? Who do you train with to get better? Since you've been the best in the world now for the last 25 years. He had been the best in the world. The last 20 years, he had been the best in the world. And that's exactly what he told me. He said the training is all in your mind. He said that basically he trains with us, his students, to get better. That he didn't need people better than him to help him improve and help him develop and help him get better. And that was so profound for me, because for me, back then, my mindset was always like, you got to train with the toughest guys. You got to train with the best guys. You got to, go and do hard trainings if you want to get better, and basically hard trainings every day to get better. And always training with guys better than you. We have this term, steel sharpens steel. And so it was always really curious to me, how did Rickson get better? Who was he training with that would help him improve? And the crazy thing is in those days, by this time, Rickson was already, close to 40 years old, around 40 years old. He wasn't training as frequently, or at least I wasn't seeing him in the gym. I didn't see him in the gym every single day training hard. But he would still come in whenever there would be a world champion black belt, or, a guy that was coming from Brazil, a black belt from Brazil that was really good. He would still come in and train with them and just mow through them. Treat them basically like a white belt. And I knew that he was constantly getting better, because even then, the techniques and by this time I had already been training with Rickson probably 6 years, 7 years, and I saw the stuff even a few years ago that he was teaching. There were slight adjustments and improvements to it, and so I knew that he was still getting better. And I even had a conversation with him one time about who would win, the 25-year-old Rickson or the 40-year-old Rickson, and he said the 40-year-old Rickson would absolutely destroy the 25-year-old Rickson. And even though he didn't have the same cardio, and though he didn't have the same physicality as he did when he was 25, he had more injuries, his technique was so much sharper and so much precise that he could basically use less movement and less energy and basically get greater results. So back to this idea of the training is in the mind. The training is in the mind. It's so powerful, such a powerful statement. And one of the things that he mentioned to me about this, about training with students and training with guys weaker than him to help him develop, is he told me that he would create situations and create environments in the training to basically challenge himself, to make situations way more difficult for him. So even if he was training with a blue belt, he would limit his potential or limit his abilities, find different ways to limit himself, or create environments that would really handicap himself so that it would make him struggle. It would challenge him. It would still be a challenge. And so it made me reflect back to days when he was training, where there was one training that I've mentioned before where he would catch guy. I saw him training. There was about 20 guys from Brazil that had just showed up. Hoyler's team had come from Brazil, and it was the Pan Ams, and this is probably 97. The Pan Ams, I think, were in LA that year, or might it be even earlier, 96. But he lined up 20 guys along the mats. He sat in the middle and basically shark tanked himself with 20 guys sitting on the mats. And the first guy he pulled out was a black belt. He caught him 3 or 4 times or 5 times in an omoplata. Then went to the next guy, caught him 5 times in an omoplata. I was the third guy to go. And by that time, I had already seen, okay, he's catching everyone in the omoplata. I know this is what he's going for. I got to hide my arms, not let him get me in an omoplata 5 or 6 times in an omoplata. He went down the row submitting everyone in an omoplata. And so that was a technique that I never really saw him use that much in normal trainings. But that day, for some reason, he decided that's what he was working on, that's what he was going to focus on, and basically went through the whole row of us, catching everyone 5 or 6 times in an omoplata. And so that's just one example of things that he would do to basically challenge himself, you know? So if he was training with guys lower level than him, he would maybe go for a submission that he doesn't really use that much, or that he doesn't go for all the time, just so that he could develop the technique and find the intricacies and understand really how to catch and how to set up the position, how to set up the movement. And he would just be focused on that one submission. And so for all of us, you know, when it comes to the training is in the mind, that's the thing, is we can all develop and improve with anyone. We don't need to have training partners better than us. It's up to us to create these situations, create the environment where we are challenged, where we're forced to struggle, and therefore we're forced to improve. So one of the things that I do in my training all the time is, you know, I put myself in bad situations. I allow myself to put on the bottom of cross-eyed constantly, on the bottom of mount constantly, and see if I can get out, and see if I can get out using less and less energy. So even against white belts and blue belts, I tell them, hey, listen, your job is not to attack me. Your job is just to hold me. And usually what happens is, if they're just focused on holding and controlling a position, it tends to make things way more difficult for me, because they're not opening up, they're not attacking, they're not going for things and creating a lot of movement. Their job is basically just to maintain the position. So that can create a more difficult time in being able to escape positions, and then seeing if I can get out. Or the other thing that I do sometimes is I allow myself to get caught in submissions. I allow them to maybe put a hand in my collar. I allow them to grab my arm and secure my arm and get like a Kimura grip, and then see if I can still defend myself and see if I can still get out. And then what things I'll do is I'll progressively allow situations to get worse and worse and worse. And so, you know, even to the point where I'll let people get me in a bow and arrow and secure their grips, and then see if I can still get out, or see if I can make adjustments to kind of find comfort. So this idea behind the training and how to develop yourself to an extremely high level can help all of us. And it's what Rickson really did, because by that time, like I said, there was no one better than him. He had been the best in the world for 20 years, 20 plus years. And even the number 2 guys in the world, even the current world champions at the time that were either his weight or even heavier than him, he would go through like white belts. He would, you know, I would see him tap guys out like this, black belts, you know, every 2 or 3 minutes, or every minute in training, depending. You know, and you hear, you know, stories all the time about these black belts that after leaving would always say, gosh, I felt like a white belt. So he was not just a little bit better than him. He was, you know, way better than him, yards and yards and yards further ahead in his development, in his skill. And so even those guys wouldn't really challenge him much if he really wanted to go, if he really wanted to put it on him. And so that's the thing, is really, how do we develop ourselves? How do we get better when we don't have guys constantly better than us to improve? Well, the training is in the mind. We need to create these environments. We need to create the situations and the circumstances which challenge us, put ourselves constantly in uncomfortable predicaments, uncomfortable situations. And that is, you know, also just a philosophy for life. All of the growth happens in the uncomfortable places, in comfortable zones. And so even when you're training with white belts, for example, a lot of times sometimes I'll train with one hand. I'll tie my belt in my hand and just do one-handed training. That's something that I actually did for about 6 months to a year when I had a shoulder injury. Is I would tie my hand in my belt so I wasn't using my arm, so I could still train and develop myself, still improve. But, you know, I was limited. I was handicapped. Sometimes I'll do it with two hands in my belt and see how I do. Sometimes I'll train with two training partners at a time. I'll do 2-on-1 trainings. Some days I'll train and I'll just go for chokes. Some days I'll train and I'll just go for arm bar. Some days I'm just going for one specific arm bar, maybe an inverted arm bar. Some days I'm just going for a triangle, and I'm going to see if I can catch everybody in the triangle that day and really how to develop that. And some days I just play defense. Some days I'll work on my offense, and some days I'll say, okay, I'm going to work on my offense from the close guard if my close guard is feeling rusty. And so I'll constantly put myself in that situation. So really, the training is all up to us. Whatever we decide to focus on, that's one of the biggest instruments and tools to development, is really picking one thing and focusing a specific aspect of our game to develop. And once we focus on that aspect, once we decide on that specific aspect, how do we create a handicap, or how do we limit ourselves so that even if our training partners are not better than us, they're still able to challenge us, and they're still able to push us, and there's still environments and circumstances which force us to struggle and therefore improve. So anyways, guys, I hope that was helpful for you guys. And like I said, it was probably the most profound thing, one of the most profound things that Rickson had ever told me. And it made such a huge impact in my game and my training. And even now, currently, I still apply this every day to my training.